pre-call with you a couple weeks ago. We got a little philosophical, and you talked about growing the company and taking it to the next level. And that was that moment where, like, that's where we want to go on this call. Okay. So, one of the guardrails we used to just kind of get us started was take us, back a few years. You're leaving Tully, you're driving to Ithaca. You've probably done that trip 1,000 times, but you're driving down through Cortland, through Dryden. You're in Ithaca for several years. You're coming home every now and then. Take us up and down that road trip, starting a company in college. I mean, let's start there. And granted, if you want to take us back to a 13-year-old Matt Cummings, we'll hear about him too.
Sure. One of the things that you hear from entrepreneurs is that they heard certain conversations at the dinner table. My dinner table was a little bit different. I had two parents that were in education. My mom was actually my substitute teacher at Tully Elementary School when I was in first grade, and up through like sixth grade, she would be a substitute teacher. And then she got a job at Onondaga Central to teach 7th and 8th grade home economics. My dad worked for the Central New York School Boards Association, so he was really working with educators and boards to try to support the local schools. So, we're an education-based family, and a lot of the conversations that we would have around the dinner table were more like what's going on in the world, and watching the news with Dan Rather, and having more like macro level conversations about politics and all the things that were happening in the mid 80s, 90s, politics, all that type of stuff. I think a lot of that shaped my view of business and the world. And around 7th or 8th grade, I made the decision that I want to try to go to Manlius Pebble Hill School. And that's where I would later meet my co-founder, Pat Daniel, and my COO, Ralph Torillo. So again, kind of against the grain, you don't hear about many companies that started where you met someone on a soccer field, when you were 14 and the other person was 13. That was literally my first introduction, almost now 30 years ago, to the co-founder of my company. And I wasn't really friends with Pat. I was better friends with Ralph. But the common theme that I had with Pat is that we were both building bulletin board systems, which was, for you guys, you might not be familiar with it, but it was the early days of the internet before there was the World Wide Web. There was actually what were called BBSs, where you could connect over a 2400 baud modem and a phone line to other houses. There were bulletin board systems themselves that existed in Syracuse. One of the first ones was a company called Dreamscape that later got bought. But Dreamscape was like a mainstream bulletin board system that you could dial into, and they had multiple nodes that allowed you to dial in. And one of the only people that I knew at our school that was also on these bulletin board systems was Pat. And so I remember being maybe like 12 or 13 years old, and my neighbor, actually, who was 2 years younger than me in Tully, taught me a lot about computers. Like he was way smarter and knew way more than I did. His name was Casey Howe. And he printed out a school paper that I had that I sent over there was a thing called Z-Term, which was basically the early days of the World Wide Web. It was before email. And I remember my dad saying like, whoa, this is gonna be big, something like that. And if you fast forward through high school, Pat had gone way more advanced than me. He had web hosting that he was doing through high school. He built a really great business before he actually was old enough to have a bank account. And so he's trying to figure out how to deposit money into an account without his parents finding out. That was my early day pedigree for what I do now. So I was actually working at Manlius Pebble Hill at 19, the summer going into my sophomore year at Cornell, and Pat Daniel, my partner's mom, walked through the lobby, and she was talking about her son and everything that he was doing down at Marist College, and how like IBM had hired them to show them how he had set up his servers in Rochester, and he was doing contract work for IBM. And I was like, man, I got to get reconnected with this guy. And so back in those days, it was AOL Instant Messenger. It's up for dispute who messaged to, but one way or another, we got in touch with each other. We ended up a couple days later at the All Night Egg plant in DeWitt, and I came down from Cornell and he came up from Poughkeepsie, and we sat there with a pad of paper and we started constructing a business plan. And that was the start of a journey together 22 or 23 years ago this month. But that was really where the journey began for the two of us. And I'll turn it back over to you. That was a long answer, but kind of give you the visual.
Oh, I love it. Can I ask you one question? Working at MPH, or what were you doing?
I was working as a receptionist.
And
we have new employees that come to the company and they ask like what my jobs were previous to Terakeet. I think they're expecting like, well, I had the summer internship at Goldman Sachs, and then but my jobs were, I worked at a janitor at St. Leo's Church in Tully when I was 14, 15. And then when I turned 16, going into 17 summer, I worked on a fishing boat in Kodiak, Alaska for 3 months. And I was working on a tenderer. I made it sound glamorous over the years, but my job was to shovel the fish into the tank. I remember I got there the first day and there were these two great Samoan guys, Eddie and T, and they were kind of chuckling and they go like this, get down in the tank. And it was my first day. So it was 200,000 gallon tank and there's fish everywhere. It's totally disgusting. I didn't eat salmon for like 15 years. And so I'm scrubbing these salmon that are caught around the pipes, and there's stuff in there that looks like it's been in there for like months. And it took me like the entire day. I got the whole thing clean. I had like blisters on my fingers, and they pulled me back out, and they're just like dying laughing. They're just laughing. And I'm like, what are you guys laughing at? And they're like, you do realize you don't get paid until we're at sea, right?
Oh my
and I'm
God.
like, so I didn't get paid for that? They're like, no, man, you don't get paid for 10 days. That was an interesting lesson for me. I don't know what the business translation of it would be. I guess maybe check your contract before you start doing work. I still can't believe my parents let me do that. The thing that summer really taught me was work ethic, and watching how hard these guys worked, and the conditions that they were willing to put themselves through to feed their families and to earn a buck was something that I really had not seen before. It was a real learning experience for me, and I actually wrote my college essay based on that experience.
It's amazing to think about a 17-year-old kid, like you said, letting your parents letting you go away for days and living on a boat. And
I remember, like, again, we're talking pre-email. You're talking about just the early stages of like the internet, no text messaging. So it was snail mail. A letter would take maybe 10 or 15 days to get to me. But my parents were great and my friends were great, and they were sending me letters, and it was always exciting when I would, pull up to the processing ship and I would have mail there that I could read. And, as we would be underway, as they call it, at night, and I'm, sitting on the top of the ship and kind of looking at the stars and the vast ocean, listening to Enya, honestly, on a Walkman. That was where I kept a journal, and that was where a lot of my ambitions and kind of what I saw for my future professional goals, personal goals, that was where a lot of that for me kind of came together, and where it began to develop before I had really done anything.
And at that point, so now you come home and it's fall of your senior year. Are you already geared up mentally that you want to go to Cornell, or did you do the whole gamut of looking at multiple schools and not really sure where you want to go?
I had like an anxiety attack during the year, and I don't remember the details of it entirely, but I didn't end up really submitting many applications. And I had visited all these schools, and I wasn't a great student, but I had amped it up like when it mattered. And my friends were all getting accepted to colleges and things like that. And I just didn't end up sending in a lot of my applications, more just because I didn't want to get the rejection letters. And I ended up going my freshman year to SUNY Albany, which is a place that I was lucky enough to get into. And I met some really great professors there. I got into some really great programs, and I got a job as an intern in the lieutenant governor's office in the Capitol building. I was a political science major, and with the permission of some of my teachers, I was already learning the trade of getting permission to go outside of the confines of normal schooling, as I would later find at Cornell, and take a bus down the main avenue there down to the Capitol building. And 3 to 4 days a week, I was working as an intern, a paid intern in the lieutenant governor's office. And that was a really great experience. And I remember I decided like right early on, I was getting really good grades and I was pretty hard pressed to try to get into Cornell. And I really wanted to get into the ILR school. And so I went and I did an interview and I took a test, and my dad came up with the idea, well, why don't you have the lieutenant governor write you a letter? So I walked into her office, this one day that she was there, and I was like, hey, would you be willing to write me a letter to Cornell? And she was like, oh yeah, of course. And the person that I was working with was like, why don't you just write the letter and then see if she'll sign it? So I got like the official stationery, I wrote the letter out, and it was like, this is the most amazing intern we've ever had. He's brilliant, like all types of bullshit. And I knocked on her door, and she was actually taking a nap in her office. She was like all like disoriented or whatever. And I was like, hey, remember the letter? Will you sign this? And like, she literally didn't even read it, and she signed the letter, and I still have it. I have a copy of it. And it's kind of hilarious to look at now. But I guess in some ways that's probably how I got into Cornell. I'm sure it didn't hurt. So that was an early learning in ingenuity.
Well, we talk about it a lot. I've got kids who are 2 in college, 1 in high school, and my boy's in the middle of 2 girls, and he's a decent student, but his, what he has and what he brings to the table is common sense and ingenuity and knowing how to work with people. Yeah. And it's kind of chip off the old block. I'm not a good student. I wasn't a good student, but I know how to interact with people. And I think that's a skill set that probably paid you dividends to get into Cornell by just, to write your own letter and being smart enough to just, make it happen. And there you go. So you leave freshman year and you start going to Cornell in the fall of your sophomore year, or did you leave mid?
Fall my sophomore year. And that was when I got connected with Pat, and we met at the All Night Egg plant. Wow. And by that summer, we were doing software and consulting for a number of businesses, but our biggest business was ISP in Syracuse. It was a $12,000 contract, and at the end of the summer, we went in to get the final check from the gentleman that ran the company, the CEO, and he said to my business partner, I'm going to give you your first lesson in business. I'm not going to pay you. And he didn't pay us for the work that we did. And I used to Google this guy and have all these ideas of running into him on the street and beating the shit out of him and getting him arrested or whatever. But that was one of those early lessons as well, that what goes around comes around in business, and how you treat people comes back to you. And he later, got kicked out of the company for embezzlement, and and all, his top 10 on Google is all negative, and he's committed all kinds of horrible atrocities in business since then. It was actually a lesson, and it was a lesson that my dad had told me early on, which is when you get a bad feeling and you enter into a deal, when you get a bad feeling, there's something instinctual in you that is telling you that, and you need to listen to that. And I've used that in business for many years as a tool to be able to dictate whether or not we're going to do certain things or do certain deals. And my intuition, and I think Pat's intuition over the years, has helped us a lot with business dealings, with employees, with investors and opportunities. And so, you know, I think that $6,000 lesson in hindsight was one of the worst things that could have happened to us at the time, because we needed the money and I was paying my way through school and I needed to make that payment. But for $6,000, we got a pretty valuable lesson, which has guided me, you know, over the years.
I like that.
But we're 30 minutes in and we're still only in the year 2000, and we got another 21 years to go.
Well, we can always have you back on another time.
I could send a
all
whole
right, so
episode just on your time on the ship there. That's awesome.
It's so funny. So I think we're transitioning into one of the topics that Pete and I really wanted to understand was, and again, I thought Pete maybe had thought of this word, but then he realized it was already existed. And that's, how do you pronounce it?
Dormpreneur.
So would you consider yourself a dormpreneur? Are you familiar with that?
Well, I can deduce from, you know, the Latin what that probably means. But yeah, so, you know, the company was launched out of a dorm room in Cascadola Hall at Cornell. But, you know, I would call it a hybrid dormpreneur, because the interesting twist in the story is that Pat dropped out of college because he was a year younger to be able to facilitate, you know, what is now today Terakeet coming into existence. And it's something that I've never forgotten, because he was selfless enough to see that he was going to be spending an extra year in school if he went all the way through. What Pat did was a big deal, because it allowed us to hit the ground running when I graduated from Cornell. So Pat left school and he maintained an office in his dad's printing shop in Syracuse, right above what's now like Funk and Waffles. And he moved there, and then that allowed him to be closer to me and the two of us to be able to work more closely together. And my trade-off with Pat was that when I came back down to Syracuse, I could also have a spot in his dad's printing shop with him to be able to work, but that any class that he wanted to attend at Cornell, we looked enough alike that he could get in to any class that he wanted to go to. So, I mean, I think it's unclear at this point who attended more classes at Cornell, whether it was myself or Pat. And then the other trade-off was that he could come to any fraternity party and bring anyone he wanted. And I cut a deal with the president of the fraternity where I could have 2 bedrooms. And so I had a second room. And I think, as far as I'm concerned, Phi Gamma Delta Cornell University, to this day, I'm the only student that had 2 bedrooms, an office and a bedroom. And I thought I was real cool. I had, you know, 3 CNBC screens on and a Linux like terminal and a whole thing. And I mean, people would walk by and be like, what a total nerd. But but that was my that was how we operated things. 2 McGraw Place was the address, and Pat spent a lot of time there with me.
That's awesome. And you guys weren't buddies at MPH. You just knew each other.
We played soccer together. Like, we were friendly. You know, MPH is a very small, tight-knit community. So like, I knew who kids were in middle school and lower school.
Right.
So that's the thing, is like, everybody knows who everybody is at Manlius Public Health.
That's awesome. You know, Pete, at this point, you've got a million things going through your head.
Your demeanor is very similar to Chris Panbianco. So how did you two come together?
That's a good question. I think I met Chris more than 10 years ago, I want to say. There was like this little building over near Little Italy, like around the time Terakeet was starting, and it's at Bankers Healthcare Group, and I never knew what it was. And you know, we never had our name on the side of a building until recently, but we had this little, 316 South Clinton Street startup where we started taking over floors. And I think just at some point, I was curious what they were doing, or they were curious what we were doing. And that was how I got to know Chris. And we hit it off, and we ended up doing some work together. And then this like ecosystem that really was like Terakeet and Bankers Healthcare Group, it started to expand, and you started to see companies like TCG Player and Swipe to Spin, all people that were coming up like alongside us and after us, and you started to see these businesses pop up. And I think in certain ways, that's been one of the most fun things to see. Is it's not just like old companies that moved to downtown, it's startup companies that decided to start there and grow there. And it's clearly had a major impact, on the community. And just, we had someone tell us like in the last couple of years that in the Armory Square area, 2/3 of the applications that they get for housing are from Terakeet employees. So yeah, I would say like, they're a company where I'll shoot Chris a message because they always beat us on like the rankings, the best companies to work or whatever. And I'll shoot him a message and kind of bust his chops. And then on the rare occasions where we beat them on something, he'll send a message and bust my chops. And that's kind of the relationship that we've built. So I was really thankful when he introduced me to you guys and talked to me about the opportunity to kind of tell our story. Yeah.
When you talk about the culture and the people who are working for you downtown, and maybe they're living downtown, tell me if I'm wrong, but what's the term Keeters? Is that right? Is there,
Yeah.
Is that a cultural thing? Is that an idea that your staff and employees brought up?
I don't particularly love it, but my mom loves it, and I'll tell you the significance of that. So the thing I talked about going to MPH, one of the ways I was able to go to MPH was my mom would work with two severely disabled members of a household, and she would use all her kind of like Zen ways that she would with her students to stimulate, brain activity and rub their feet and talk to them and read to them. And I think as I got older, appreciated that more and more, that she made those sacrifices, including, working for Karen's Catering over the summer, waiting on the tables of some of my fellow MPH kids' parents to make ends meet and try to help me get through Manly's Pebble Hill. So at the time at which we were successful enough and had built a big enough business that I could facilitate it, I went to my business partner and I asked if he'd be willing to hire my mom. We were about 13, 14 people. Hire my mom, I think this was 2009, 2010, as an office manager to support our growth. And so my mom came on, her name's Martha, in 2009 or 2010 to become our office manager. And my mom is the one who uses the word Keeters probably more than anyone. So I don't know if she invented it or if she just embraced it and further pushed it out into the ethos. But that's kind of what I connect it to.
I heard your mother likes to have the Friday check-ins, and she loves, back when pre-COVID, to have the staff in, have the employees in. You guys would do bagels and food and all the fixings, and your mom was the person that you would walk by as you entered work every day, and she was ingrained in the culture. So we knew we'd end up talking about Martha, so I'm so glad you brought it up on your own. So tell us about that. What's that like to have, 10 years now, pre-COVID, and your mom being, kind of the face of the company?
So when I told my mom what I wanted to do and she agreed to it, they did a retirement thing at Onondaga Central for her. And you would think somebody that made, $50,000 a year and taught for 35 years would get some kind of a grand finale. But I went to a little ceremony. It was just my mom and I in 2010, and they mispronounced her name and they gave her this like tin on our way out, and it was literally a tin full of candy. It probably cost like less than $5. And so in certain respect, it made me feel bad that that was how she was valued. But in the flip side, seeing how she's been valued at our company, by our company, and by the people that work at our company has been kind of like a second act for her that I know she really values. Part of our journey really centered around my mom. In 2010, 2011, I had a guy who was kind of like my little brother named Mark Murray that I had grown up with. And Mark was actually with us at that ISP where the guy screwed us out of the money. And so he was like 17 years old at the time. And he got diagnosed with leukemia as he was going to go off into the Navy. And he almost died with his first bout with leukemia and, being on life support and in the ICU. He was in the ICU for almost 11 months. He had to go through all kinds of adversity, and he actually got to the point where he was driving a car and he was walking, and he was able to, come back to Terakeet. So he got like a second chance at life, and he got to do that at our company, which was great. And we had maybe 15 employees, and then my mom joined and he called my mom Auntie Martha. And in 2010, 2011, 2009, he probably had gone through another bone marrow transplant because he had gotten leukemia again. In 2011, he was renting an apartment right next to my apartment in Armory Square, and he got a lung infection. I went to Buffalo with him for Roswell Park for almost a month and was working remote. And then unfortunately in February, so we're coming up on the anniversary of that, February of 2011, he passed away. And that was really tough. And you can imagine like a 14, 15 person company that all the men at the company were carrying his casket into St. Leo's Church in Tully as the bagpipes played. Going through that is like, if you've ever been through anything like that, it's pretty tough and self-reflective. And about 2 months into that, my mom came into my office and she was crying. I assumed it was about Mark, and she told me that she had been diagnosed with breast cancer and it was in the lymph nodes. And I was just kind of like, what's going on here? And then another person who I'm very close with, who's been with us for 12 years now, came into my office. At that point, she was probably only a year into Terakeet, and she told me that her mother had been diagnosed with a similar cancer. It was shortly after that we just decided that we wanted to talk about where this company was going, because it had been about 10 years and we had gone from like 0 to 15 people. And Pat and I decided that we wanted to do something much bigger and better than what we had built up to that point. And we didn't really realize how much time we had wasted. So what happened was we got the name of a business coach by the name of Tim Ahern that we met at Starbucks in Armory Square. And we reluctantly kind of went to this meeting because, we're 30 years old and we know it all. And we sat down with him, and he asked us first what our vision for the company was. And after like 20 minutes of bullshit from me, that doesn't say much when people, he's a man of less words. He was like, well, if we could get that down to like 2 or 3 sentences, that would be good. And then he said, what are your goals for the company? And I said, I don't know. And he said, well, if you can't tell me what the goals for the company are, how do the 15 people that work for you know what they're supposed to come to work and do every day? And then he said, what are the values of your company? And I gave him a list of some things. And he said, if we're going to work together and you're going to continue to hire people and you're going to grow, you're going to need to know what values set the tone for the people that are going to come after the 15 people that you've hired. And you're going to need to work on that. And we spent the next year every Monday working on vision, values, goals with Tim. And it was like magic for the first several months and then into the next couple of years. And, we set some really, he calls them hairy, audacious goals, but we said, we were going to buy out our original investors. They didn't even realize, some of them, that we still were a company. that was in business, we said that we were going to take like these 2 floors that were kind of 2 separate companies, and we were going to combine them into one. And then we said within 5 years, we were going to get to 25 million in revenue. And we thought that we would do that with about 125 employees. So imagine 10 times your revenue and 10 times your number of employees. And I remember like driving in the car with Pat somewhere, and he was driving and I was in the passenger seat, and I was just like, hey, what should we make the number? I think a lot of like entrepreneurs think that you have some precision and like spreadsheets when you come up with numbers. We just made it up, and that was it. And so we spent the next couple of years really laser focused on that. Around 2014, 2015, the magic kind of stopped. And we hit this wall where we had accomplished all of our goals, but we just really couldn't get from like 125 to 175. We hired consultants, we talked to other entrepreneurs, and we just like literally couldn't figure it out, to the point where we even thought about selling the company to a private equity firm, and went through a process actually to do that. And then we came out of that process deciding that we weren't going to sell the company. And I had joined this group called YPO, Young Presidents Organization. And I just one day like woke up and I put out a message to YPO and I said, has anyone worked with a coach who's helped them get to like 100 million in revenue from where they were? And one of the names that I got was a gentleman by the name of Mark Kennedy that has sold his company to Publicis Group for around $100 million a couple of years earlier, and had become a consultant for this group called Red Strategy Group. And we got on a phone call with him. And before we got on, Pat was like, just so you guys know, I'm already bought in to this guy. Like, I read the book. And I was like, I didn't even know there was a book. It talks about what certain companies need to do to break through. And I recommend that book to any entrepreneur that's facing a similar situation of scale. And what we really found out through working with Mark, who interestingly would later become the president of Terakeet, but what we really found out is that there's an entrepreneurial journey that you go on with different parts of the company. So what we found was that 15-person company has a micromanager at the top, and that was me. And I could basically stand over somebody's computer and say, type this, say this, respond this way, talk to the customer like this, let me take that deal. And I had 15 people that would listen to what I said, but those 15 people were incapable of having the empowerment to be able to go out and inspire 15 more people, which would have made us a 30-person company. When you get to 30 people, it's pretty easy to get to 50. And when you get to 50, it's pretty easy to get to a 100 if you actually don't pull back, because it's scary when you get to 50. Because now your hand's off the wheel and you have all these empowered people and you're like, whoa, what are they doing? I need to know. And you pull back and you can hamper the growth at 50. But if you allow people to be empowered and you continue to hire good people, vision, values, goals, and you do those things, you can get to 100, you can get to 125. And sheer will, you can get to 25 million in revenue and 125, 150 people. But what happens is you built an organization of 150 people who are highly empowered, but not very well aligned around a company initiative or set of goals. And so the process that we went through was to set a vision for the company. In our case, it was to move up market, work with a lot larger companies, and to set some initiatives around the different departments that were very clear. When you're aligned around those behaviors cause the entire company to move behind those initiatives and then do tasks that are going to support those initiatives. So that change in behavior, that change in goals, and then the 90-day tasks that lead up to those goals changes outcomes. And the company begins to change, and you go through a metamorphosis where you have more alignment, actually lower empowerment, which is counterintuitive to everything that we read in books. And then all the work on the business, not inside the business, but getting outside the business and looking in, that you have to do to drive that growth. We're this fall coming up on our third year of that. We set some pretty crazy goals for the company and for our growth, we'll just cross, by the time this is out, the 300 and some odd employee threshold, and pretty audacious revenue numbers for our company, given where we were, when we started this process. And I know that was a question around Martha, but that was also a good way to kind of tell the journey that brings us to today.
Yeah, I'm glad you kept going, because my eyes were a little watery there for a few of your moments. So I really appreciate you being as vulnerable as you've been and sharing some of the things that are very relatable to me. And we don't have time to go into those today, but
who hasn't, not to get political, but before the Super Bowl, they had the Biden interview and they asked him about his son, and again, it's not a political statement, but who hasn't had a person in their family that's dealt with addiction? Who hasn't had a person in their family or at their company that's dealt with cancer?
Sure.
Who hasn't started a business and thought to themselves that they're going to go out of business, or that they don't have what it takes, or that they're a fraud, and that there's an imposter syndrome that sits there where you're going to be found out because you're doing something that you've never done before, where you feel like you're going to be judged. I had that and continue to have that because people laughed at us. And, walking around with a Marshall suit and a briefcase in Syracuse, going asking people with white hair that run law firms and, the county for money to launch a tech business in Armory Square in 2000, people laughed at us and made fun of us. And it's hard not to carry some of that with you.
The fact that you're able to embrace it and talk about it, to me, for what it's worth, you're at the helm of a company at one of the most interesting times to be doing anything, and that perspective and that guidance and that ability to be vulnerable, I think, is one of the best attributes someone running a company or running a family or running anything where humans are there could have. So my hat is off to you. I really appreciate you, Mac, and I like how you roll, my friend.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I'm happy that we got to do this, and I think we were talking about, when we kind of did our pre-call, what would be the goal, or what are you guys trying to do? And I really appreciated hearing your journey about how this all came about. And one of the things that I said to you was that I think one of the things that I'm proudest of is that we've created an ecosystem with Terakeet where I hope, and I would throw Bankers Healthcare Group certainly ahead of us on this, where just even one person that was thinking about leaving and going and starting their business someplace else looks at this region and says, hey, somebody else did it, and that's enough for me to take a chance. And there's going to be a larger correlation to the growth of our city, the success of our city, our ability to attack poverty and the problems that this area has, I believe, through the launch of new businesses in our region than any other political or business initiative. And I've been banging that drum for like 20 years. And the fact that you guys are in this region and are promoting this region and promoting businesses like mine, and that you're getting us out to audiences of other potentially young entrepreneurs or people who work at a company that are thinking, I'm going to go take a risk and I'm going to decide to go do something bold and leave, and I'm going to do it here. Like I said, if we can reach one or two people through this, that's why I agreed to do it. I think it's amazing.
Well, thank you. And I hope that, when you get back to Central New York and the weather's cooperative in the spring, we can go sit outside of the sidewalk in Armory Square and grab a coffee, grab a beer, grab whatever we want, and have a conversation in person. I would like to.
We will. I'll see you both in April.
All right, Mac. We appreciate your time very much.